Hi, everyone. I believe we are officially live now. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a little heads up about the format of this talk. So you are all on Facebook Live, but I am on Zoom. So you can see and hear me, hopefully, but I cannot see you. However, there is going to be some time at the end of this talk for some Q&A and discussion. So if you have any questions or comments as I'm going through some of the highlights of my book, please feel free to leave your questions or remarks in the chat, and we can get to them at the end. So let me just start by introducing myself. My name is Maggie McKinley. I'm a professor of English at Harper College in Illinois, which is the northwest suburb of Chicago. And I teach composition courses there and also American literature courses. And in terms of my field of research, my main area of focus is post-World War II American literature. And so Joan Didion, the subject of the book I'll be talking about today, of course, kind of falls within that group of authors who's doing most of their major writing in the second half of the 20th century. But a number of my previous publications have not focused directly on Didion, so I thought I'd just say a little bit about how I ended up here and then sort of take us into why I decided to write a book on Didion and nostalgia and what I'm hoping it can help reveal about her work and our moment in time. And so when I first kind of delved into post-World War II American Lit, I was writing a lot about representations of gender in American fiction. So I've written on a number of authors kind of addressing specifically their representations of masculinity. That was my first book. I've written on Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Saul Bellow, Norman Mailer, Philip Roth. And in recent years, I've done a lot of my work on Philip Roth and Norman Mailer. And during that time, Joan Didion has always remained in view for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think, I've always admired her work. My journey to Didion and my admiration for her is probably a familiar story for anyone else who enjoys her work. I picked up Slouching Towards Bethlehem in college and became really enamored with the cadences of her voice and the unique elements of her prose and her ability to really take us to a specific place via her writing, and of course, represent specific moments in American culture and history through her particular lens. But I also kept being kind of reminded of her work and its prescience and its notability as I was working on Norman Mailer and writing a book called Understanding Norman Mailer and editing a collection called Norman Mailer in Context. Because Didion herself was a fan of Mailer's work. She wrote some positive reviews of a number of his books, maybe most famously her review of The Executioner's Song. She did a screenplay adaptation of his book, The Deer Park. She was also a big fan of that book. And there's a number of other, I think, overlapping themes and ideas between these two iconoclastic writers that I hope someday to also expand on. So she kept kind of coming up. So I had delivered a couple of conference talks on Didion and Mailer and written a couple of short pieces on her, but I knew that I wanted to dive a little deeper and do a longer project that really encompassed her whole career. And as I embarked on this, I began, we all began rereading everything that she had written, finding the pieces that I hadn't uncovered before. And one of the things that really grabbed me as I was rediscovering a lot of her work in the last several years was how much pretty much every text that she has composed engages in some way with her relationship to time, to the past, present, and the future, and specifically how nostalgia is at the center of nearly everything she wrote, her fiction, her nonfiction, from her earliest publications in the late 50s and early 60s, all the way up until her last memoir, Blue Nights, published in 2011. And I wanted to really engage more with this topic. And what surprised me as I was also reading more about Joan Didion was how little had actually been said about her nostalgia. And that might sound surprising because I think in some respects we often take for granted that nostalgia is at the heart of Didion's canon, right? So when I did encounter references to nostalgia in Didion's work, they're often fairly cursory, right? Taking it for granted in that way. People would say, oh, of course, Joan Didion, she's in her early work nostalgic for an old California, for a former kind of America, for a certain American ideal. And this comes through in her famous writings about California. And in other places where I would see nostalgia mentioned in relation to Joan Didion, it was often leveled as a kind of accusation, right? It's something that either she was trying to shake or something that was considered a flaw, maybe a sign of her um, entrenched traditionalism or a myopia. And when I was reading her text, I just didn't see it that way. So I was really curious to see if I could find a different way to kind of explain and grapple with how she's deploying nostalgia in her work. And that led me to this book and the framework that I'll talk a little bit more about. So I actually have a few slides that I'm going to pull up here. And this is to kind of help walk through the main beats of my book and take you through the organization, some of the things that I focused on, particularly some of the central arguments of my book, and also so you have something else to look at other than the slightly cluttered background of my office. So let me pull this up here. All right. So the title of the book is The Art of Looking Back, Joan Didion and American Nostalgia. And I really do think that her engagement with nostalgia is an art, right? It develops over the course of her career. It's never quite the same, even though there's some consistencies in the way that she addresses it over the course of decades as a writer. And it's really embedded in her style. It's a theme, it's a critical tool, it's a lens, it's part of her sentence structure, it's personal, it's communal, right? There's a lot of ways to think about this. And so one of the things that I endeavored to do was kind of wrap my arms around the complexity of nostalgia as a term. And this was one of the things that bothered me a little bit about the way that nostalgia had been addressed in conversations about Didion, was that it was just used as kind of this catch-all phrase. Like she is nostalgic or she's anti-nostalgic in some cases, right? But nostalgia can mean so many things and there are so many different variations. So in its, relatively short etymological history, right, it's taken on a lot of different variances. So when it first sort of came into its modern life as a term, right, the origins of the way we might use nostalgia today, it was used to describe what was effectively a physiological condition, a disease or a malady. It's often considered to have been coined by Dr. Johannes Hofer when he was observing Swiss soldiers having a symptomatic reaction to homesickness, as he interpreted it. Over the course of the 18th and 19th century, the use of nostalgia as a term also shifted, and it was used to describe sort of a philosophical conundrum and also a psychological condition, but it was still considered a malady that needed to be treated. It's also been used in discussions of grief and mourning, and depending on the theorists that you read and what you're reading, it is sometimes described as something that can interfere with healthy mourning practices, and sometimes it is seen to sort of facilitate healthy grieving and mourning, and that's something I'll talk a little bit more when I talk about nostalgia in Didion's memoirs. It's also considered part of cultural memorization and collective memory in a really positive way. So that's a more productive way. Some cultural theorists, like Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer, have thought about nostalgia. And then, in our modern age, in the 20th century in particular, it's kind of seeped into conversations about art and media through the work of writers like Frederick Jameson. And it's clearly become, a marketing tool. It's everywhere in our capitalist consumerist culture. It is baked into political rhetoric. It's used as a political strategy, and this also becomes a focus of Didion's later writing as well. What I primarily found most useful in terms of language to describe nostalgia was the considerations of nostalgia as a sociological construct. So a lot of the text that I draw from in my book are sociological studies of nostalgia, although I do bring in all of these other elements too, and sort of apply them as needed and as appropriate when helping to discuss Didion's work. And I've just listed a few examples here at the bottom of the slide to give you a sense of the range of ways that people have talked about nostalgia. A more recent critic, Jennifer Wenzel, has talked about nostalgia as imperialist or anti-imperialist, which is something that definitely connects to nostalgia's national and political dimensions. Fred Davis, who was writing in the 70s, tried to categorize nostalgia into these different columns, calling it simple or reflexive or interpretive, which are different ways of discussing sort of the gradations of our self-awareness of our own nostalgia. But I found Svetlana Boym's book, The Future of Nostalgia, to be most helpful. And the terms that she primarily uses to distinguish between different kinds of nostalgia are reflective and restorative. And so restorative nostalgia thinks of itself as a kind of absolute truth. So this is the kind of nostalgia that looks back on the past and says, I wish it were exactly like that. That's how it used to be. That's how I want it to be now. This is a perfect snapshot. Reflective nostalgia is something that, as Boehm says, calls the idea of absolute truth into doubt. It's always questioning itself. And so at the heart of this kind of nostalgia is really a paradox, right? It's a longing for a past place or a past time that may never have existed, right? And the reflective nostalgic recognizes that they're perhaps longing for something that has been revised to a point where elements of it are imagined or fictitious, and they're sort of grappling with questions surrounding why they have that impulse and how to negotiate that. And again, this is just a sampling of the many diverse ways that nostalgia has been discussed. So the way that I have organized the book, right, trying to tackle all of Didion's work and the way she's using nostalgia, is largely chronological, but it's also kind of stylistic and thematic. So the first chapter of the book addresses her relationship to California, which for anyone familiar with Didion's work is probably no surprise. This is probably also the area in which most ink has been spilt in terms of Didion scholarship. And this has a lot to do with the fact that Didion was writing about California for most of her life and considered herself a Californian, specifically from Sacramento at heart, right? So for Didion, there's many Californias, and Sacramento is not Los Angeles, which is not San Francisco, right? But she's often kind of labeled as this Western writer. And this has a lot of implications for the way that she develops her relationship to nostalgia early on. And so, what I am arguing in this first chapter is that her works on California, specifically her earlier pieces, her first novel, Run River, published in 1963, her novel Play It As It Lays, published in 1970, as well as a number of her non-fictional pieces published in the interim and collected in works like Slouching Towards Bethlehem, but also a later memoir, Where I Was From, where she talks about kind of reevaluates her relationship to California. That all of these exhibit what I see as a specifically reflective nostalgia that counter to what a lot of critics have said about her early nostalgia being kind of myopic and exclusive and sentimental, that she's actually always questioning it and holding it up for speculation, even in her earliest works. And what I found particularly interesting as I was writing about this is that Didion herself is pretty critical of her own early nostalgia. She calls it a pernicious kind of nostalgia. But I think when we, step back and we have more distance even than she did, as readers of her work, we can see the ways that she's not simply embracing some perfect idea of a ideal Californian or American past, but is kind of questioning it from the start. And so what she's effectively doing is using this reflective nostalgia as a tool to critique a lot of the myths on which American identity rests. rather than just sanctifying those myths. And one of the ways she does it is through the construction of her fictional protagonists who demonstrate really polar responses or navigations of their relationship to history and nostalgia. So in Run River, you have a group of people that's really tied to this idea of a past California that used to benefit them and no longer does as the land and the economy is changing. And then in Play It As It Lays, you have a protagonist who kind of rejects, or to use one of Didion's favorite words, jettisons the past entirely. And she's kind of exploring the flaws in both of these approaches. And so I see these works as this ongoing conversation with her readers and herself about what it means to be nostalgic for a particular place and time that has so much of an impact on how we see ourselves. But in the larger sense, it's also, engaging with a nostalgia for America. And I have a quote here at the top corner from Mark Fisher. And he wrote a book called Ghosts of My Life, where he examines this concept that he calls a nostalgia for the future. And he's essentially suggesting that, in our modern age, we're longing not just for a particular past that we might see a certain way, but a past where we had a specific hope for the future. So we're sort of longing to get back to where we could envision a future that never actually emerged. And he's kind of indebted to the concept of hauntology, which Derrida put forward in his theory here. But he talks specifically about how this is an American dilemma, right? And he says, if there are ghosts in America, then what was supposed to be a new beginning, a clean break, turns out to be repetition, the same old story. And that in America, we're kind of haunted by haunting. And that I think really informs our understanding of what Didion's doing in her works on California as well. And I had mentioned at the outset that I think that nostalgia in Didion's work is not just a theme, it's not just a critical tool, but it's also kind of baked into her style. And as many of you likely know, Didion has long been categorized as a new journalist of the 60s and 70s, among the group of writers who is skeptical of traditional journalism, the institutions that supported that journalism, and some of the facts and or some of the elements of narratives that were left out in the reportage of just basic facts. So, as Gay Talese once remarked, the new journalist is looking for larger truths that maybe are not just conveyed by the who, what, when, where of traditional journalism. And I think Didion's project as a writer is really to search for truths, even when she's questioning the idea of whether a truth can actually exist. And so, this form works well for her probing of narratives, her interest in cultural breakdown and narrative breakdown, but it also really lends itself to her exploration of nostalgia because reflective nostalgia is also kind of it is a project dedicated to the questioning of absolute truths, right? And asking ourselves, why do we view the past a certain way? What is the narrative we want to create? What truth are we trying to establish? Is that authentic? What are its flaws, right? All of these questions. Um, and so in her personal essays, but also her more journalistic pieces that she published in the 1960s and 70s, where she's kind of expanding beyond just her experience of California and commenting more on sort of national cultural events. This new journalistic style allows her to kind of center herself, her perspective, maybe her grappling with nostalgia, and consider how it relates to the nostalgia of the nation, of other groups of people, where it's similar, where it's different. I included this quote from Svetlana Boym at the bottom here. Nostalgia is about the relationship between individual biography and the biography of groups or nations, between personal and collective memory, because that's precisely what Didion is doing here, right? She's trying to consider her place in this larger kind of community of people who are yearning for something at a turbulent cultural moment. And the two examples that I have here of the many that I explore in this chapter show how no one really escapes her scrutinizing eye when it comes to examining the different ways people are or are not nostalgic and how that compares or contrasts with her own views. So in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, her piece on the Haight-Ashbury district, she comments that adolescents drifted from city to city, sloughing off both the past and the future as snakes shed their skins. And here one of her main concerns is the way that um, the young people that she's talking to seem to have no interest in considering any sort of past, right? What led them here or how they feel about their own past, and they're not really interested in having those conversations, and so they won't let nostalgia in, they won't let history in. But on the flip side, she's also concerned with people that seem too situated in a historical moment that doesn't exist or maybe never quite existed the way they wanted to, and that's evident in a piece that she wrote a bit later called 1950 Was More Than 20 Years Ago, and it was later collected in the White Album as part of the chapter called Good Citizens. And she's commenting on a group called the JCs, the Junior Chamber of Congress. And she interestingly calls them a true underground, a voice of people who felt not merely shocked, but personally betrayed by recent history because it was supposed to have been their time. So rather than moving forward or thinking about, what is their place in time now? Where do they go from here? They are trying to repeat this past that they think should have been theirs, right? That should have been become their future. And so there's a lot of complex nuance to the way that she's critiquing nostalgia here, right? So again, to just simply say she is or isn't nostalgic doesn't quite capture what she's doing. The next couple chapters, I think were probably for me the most fun to write. The whole book was fun for me to write because Didion is a fascinating person to spend a lot of time with on the page. But I think less has been said about these three novels here than some of her earlier works on California and her famous pieces like Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And I really think that these texts deserve a bit more attention. Democracy is probably her most acclaimed and most well known of the three, addressed most often in scholarship because of its formal experimentation. But A Book of Common Prayer, which was her novel published in 1977, and also the last thing he wanted published in 1996, I think work well in terms of kind of like creating a trilogy of these three novels. And the way that I kind of focused this chapter was thinking about these three novels as featuring protagonists who are really writing away from home rather than writing, from a home that seems like it should be more familiar but is no longer. These protagonists in these novels move away from the United States for periods of time, and that's where they have these epiphanies about America and what America really is, but also about themselves and their relationship to history. And what's interesting about these three novels is that they also address gender in intriguing ways. So throughout her career, this is, one of those contradictions that exists in Didion. Didion often denied any sort of association with feminism. She wrote a famous essay called The Women's Movement that many people hold up as an example of her anti-feminism. It is kind of a frustrating essay because she oversimplifies and discards some things about women's liberation. And I think it's really in the interest of avoiding any kind of label or category. She didn't want to be seen as sort of joining and then sort of adhering to all tenets of any particular movement. And she conducted an interview shortly before that essay was published, where she again kept insisting, I don't see my position as a woman as informing what I write. But then when she was pressed by the interviewer to say a bit more about, her views, she said, well, I think yes, because I'm a woman, my characters are female. They see events as sort of the chain of things as experienced by women. And that comes up in each of these three books, specifically through the way these women are and are not nostalgic. And so, as I sort of note here in some of the highlights of what I address in this chapter, is that her examination of the gendered nature of nostalgia in these texts also serves as a critique of institutions that she codes as masculine, and using Svetlana Boym's theory of reflective nostalgia and restorative nostalgia, we can kind of see the female narratives in these novels as being reflectively nostalgic, and the masculine institutional narratives that are held up for critique as being examples of restorative nostalgia. And this really coincides with some of the things that Didion is starting to see in real world national politics as she gets more tuned in to the country's political shifts. So this chapter, I think, is allows me to explore again the way that you can't say Didion is either all one thing or another, right? She's not completely anti-feminist, she's not feminist, she's not anti-nostalgic, she's not simply nostalgic, right? These things are all intertwined, and they also come together to allow her to comment more on the state of the nation. And sorry, this is my most chaotic looking slide, maybe appropriate considering our current political state. But this chapter in the book, chapter 4, on the pernicious nostalgia, that's Didion's phrase about her own work of national politics, is where she really drills down to what she sees as the problem with the political rhetoric that's being used throughout the course of the 80s and 90s specifically. So earlier in her career, 1977, I have this quote from Didion. Didion kind of shied away from politics. So she famously supported Barry Goldwater. She's called herself, a California Republican of a certain time. She's acknowledged the way some of her politics were libertarian inflected, but also feels like that's not really a category that can define her. And she was kind of avoidant of political conversations other than that. She says here, I never had faith that the answers to human problems lay in anything that could be called political. I thought the answers, if there were answers, lay someplace in man's soul. I have an aversion to social action because it usually meant social regulation, it meant interference, rules, doing what other people wanted to do. And when she begins writing for the New York Review of Books, she wrote her first piece in the early 1970s, but really sort of ramped up her contributions in the 1980s and then into the 90s, and throughout the rest of her career. Her attention to politics really shifts. And some people think this is because of a dramatic shift in her own belief system, which she herself has denied. She was absolutely disillusioned by the Republican Party's support of Reagan. She didn't like Reagan at all, though a lot of her early writings on the Reagans focused more on the Reagans' vibes rather than their politics. She didn't like them identifying as Californian. She thought Reagan was performing, bringing Hollywood into the government, eventually the White House. But really, she starts to focus more, I think, on the way that politics operate in the country, and the problems that political rhetoric is causing in a way that she didn't earlier in her career. So rather than seeing this as a big shift in her views, I see it more like a shift in attention. And a lot of this has to do with, again, that abiding interest in nostalgia, which she'd continue to cultivate in works like the Book of Common Prayer in 1977, Democracy in 84. She really noticed kind of the nostalgic rhetoric being used by the American government when she was reporting on the situation in Salvador. And as she's writing a lot of her pieces, some of which are cultural commentary, many of which are book reviews in the New York Review of Books, kind of that are a vehicle for more of this political critique. She sharpens her criticism of restorative nostalgia. And again, no one escapes her critical eye. And she's very critical of Reagan, but also the Clintons. She's wary of the idealism even that she sees in the Obama campaign. And it all kind of comes back to the narratives that a lot of politicians want to tell about the country, right, and what it is and what it should be. And I have the little arrow from the National Review to the New York Review of Books because one of the elements of this chapter is kind of a trajectory from her pieces that she was writing for National Review in the late 50s and early 60s compared to her pieces in the New York Review of Books. And those pieces look very different. Those publications are different. She has different amounts of space. They asked for different things. But I think even though some people, again, kind of see the National Review as this early period in Didion's life that's sort of a curiosity maybe or more aligned with conservative politics. What I was finding was, again, a lot of that same kind of just wariness in general of entrenched narratives. And her book reviews for National Review are lighter, they're funnier, they're filled with bon mots and kind of scathing critiques. But already there, she is really capturing what she sees as some of the problematic elements of language. And then in the New York Review of Books, when she's had, decades of time to kind of develop her interests and her voice and her writing, and she has more space, we can kind of see the evolution of these ideas. And so I learned quite a lot by delving into those National Review archives. And then lastly here, I have a chapter at the end of the book on Didion's memoirs. And so, in the previous chapters, I've talked about how she's kind of expanding her examination of nostalgia, taking it from, her personal upbringing, her views on California to American culture, and then national politics and gender politics. And in these memoirs, she's kind of bringing it back to the personal again. But I think one of the things that makes these works so enduring is that her experience of grief and mourning and the way she's kind of wrestling with whether or not to give in to nostalgia and whether or not it's helpful feels very universal, right? It's specific to her experience, but it's also very human. And so, as I point out here, the reflective nostalgia of her late style moves further away from this kind of desperate search for meaning or a focus on sort of the center of the nation not holding, and instead is kind of resting in this space of anxiety and wonder and doubt. That's a phrase that John Didion uses in his analysis of Didion's memoirs, where he's talking about memoirs as a place of questioning rather than a place where writers simply deliver facts of their life, which is often how they're interpreted or misinterpreted. And so here she's really examining, nostalgia as mourning, as Svetlana Boym says, for the impossibility of a return to a past or to a past version of ourselves. And here I bring in even more, theories of nostalgia that are more connected to studies of grief and mourning and psychological disciplines. And I talk a little bit about the notion of embodied nostalgia, right? The use of sensory memories that allow for the contemplation and integration of loss versus a kind of manic nostalgia that works to disavow or interfere with the mourning process. Theorists often identify this through its use of sentimentalism and romanticism, which, if you know anything about Didion, are kind of bad words for her. So this is where, in her final new publications, right, her wrestling with nostalgia lands in this really beautiful, poignant way that considers how it, again, can be negative, regressive. It can mire us in the past, but also how it's just part of the human experience, right? And as she's shown throughout her canon, I think, right, even when she's critiquing the restorative nostalgia of national politics and kind of skewering politicians that she feels use it to toxic effect. She's also kind of practicing her own reflective nostalgia by demonstrating how, even her view of what the past was, right, should be called into question and allowing that to propel her criticism rather than just saying, well, her view is the correct one and everyone else has it wrong, right? Of course, it's much more complicated than that. So I'll stop sharing uh, here, and I'll just add as a final note before we open it up to some questions that as I was finishing up the book, I have to say the work that I was doing felt more relevant than ever, right? If we think about the ways that the use of nostalgia as both a, marketing tool, but also as a mode of a political strategy, a mode of political rhetoric has really ramped up, and is being used as a way to control the narrative in a way that really uh, alarmed Didion when she saw it used that way, and is alarming now. The way that she wrote about it, the way that she critiqued those kind of strategies kind of helped me think through and explain, how detrimental the consequences might be, and also why our current moment feels unusual. Because in fact, as I was doing some research on nostalgia in cultural rhetoric today, our current presidential administration uses the term nostalgia more often in each paragraph of every speech than any other modern president, right? So it's ever present in ways that I think are often deceptive. And this is something that she was worried about, in a way that we can see her work on nostalgia is particularly prescient. Um, so there's lots more to say, but I'll stop there. And I'll see if there's any questions that maybe Corey has collected from you, or that he might want to ask about the book.
Hi, Maggie.
Hi.
Excuse me. I am getting over a cold. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. That was great. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you weren't here in the beginning, Maggie mentioned that um, everything that you'd like to ask, you could put in the chat, and I'll just communicate that to her. So if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. We do have a couple here already that I want to share. So I'd like to thank Paul from tuning in from Pittsburgh, Melissa Daggett, who is actually one of our authors. Thank you for tuning in from New York, and Lori Rollins Anderson from Baltimore, as well as Tiffany Horn-Fannin from Metro Atlanta. Thank you all for tuning in. We have a couple comments here too. Earlier, that Teresa mentioned that restorative nostalgia seems to be looking back at the past on a surface level, while reflective nostalgia is looking below the surface for deeper meaning or truth. So,
Yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. And I think you know, the other way that we can maybe interpret some of the differences between restorative nostalgia and reflective nostalgia is a kind of metacognitive thinking too, right? So in addition to reflective nostalgia being more probative, right, going beneath the surface, it's also thinking about the way that, every time we are thinking about the past or even critiquing another view of the past, like we are centering ourselves in a certain way. So we have to pause and think about, what am I bringing to this revisionist narrative, and why am I doing that?
I have a great question from Tiffany on deck, but I'm going to start with just a more general question just to kind of get going. And this is from James Long, who is one of our acquiring editors here at LZ Press. And he wanted to know how you approached analyzing Didion's prolific output. Um, we see it right and in the chapters that you mentioned, but obviously she wrote not just in fiction, essays, journalism, etc. So what was that like, sort of like making a broader statement about nostalgia in all those different kinds of work?
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it was challenging to first decide what pieces were going to get the most attention, right? Because, a lot would be worthy of some mention. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, what helped me was thinking about the text both chronologically and thematically, so I could kind of at least put them into certain categories to kind of slow down and walk through different segments of her career, right? New journalism is kind of one section, and then her later novels is another section. But I will say that one of the challenges absolutely was thinking about to what extent I wanted to or should put her nonfiction in conversation with her fiction, because I do think that, one of the things that makes Didion so tricky is that she invites interrogation of herself as a person by centering herself so often in her text, right? She's sort of saying, I believe you have to recognize the author and what they write. And in my new journalism, I'm going to be doing that. And so often today, when I read pieces about Didion, they really skew towards the biographical, right? They want to read Didion to better know who she was as a person, right? Like, is this Didion saying this about her own life, or does this give me some insight into something that seems elusive or aloof about her, right? And I think that gets into really dangerous territory, because she did write work that was just categorized as fiction, right? And I think even her new journalism, she's sharing only so much of herself with us. So I wanted to be careful not to sort of elide the difference between, her reporting on other people, her personal essay, and her fiction by putting the works in conversation. So that's something I try and draw attention to, right? Like here's what she's sharing about herself. Here is where she's clearly carefully curating an image of herself, and here is what we can only really view as fiction if we're going to be fair. But in each one of these, nostalgia is kind of popping up. So that I think was the biggest challenge, especially in the first couple of chapters. And also because when I went and did some archival research at UC Berkeley, I found in some of her notes, on one of her later novels that creates a character named Joan Didion, right? She's really doing a postmodern sort of toying with our idea of the author, right, and who she is. In her own notes to herself, she refers to the narrator, this fictional construct, as I. So she's even kind of collapsing that difference a little bit in interesting ways. And so I think just drawing attention to that so it's not fully collapsed, was something I tried to be mindful of.
I've got a question here from Tiffany Hornfannon. And it's in reference to one of the earlier slides where you were talking about too much nostalgia versus no nostalgia. So Tiffany
Mhm.
says, is this mindset of not remembering the past one reason that she encountered in San Francisco that we don't know about our own personal histories?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the main concerns she had, not just in the Slouching Towards Bethlehem essay, but in a number of essays she wrote at the time. This worry that people were becoming so divorced from any concept of the past that they were no longer able to feel like a sense of belonging to anything, and that it sort of hindered progress as well, right? So if we're thinking about problems that needed to be solved or a sense of fragmentation that needed to be mended. I think she is, as she's working out in her fiction and nonfiction, that can't really be done if somebody doesn't really have a sense of what came before them. And that was one of the things that was most startling to her when she visited the Haight-Ashbury. It's also one of the things that I think prompts people to see her take in that essay as somewhat conservative, right? That she's framed as this older generation, even though she's actually quite young when she's writing the essay. She's older than the teens she's interviewing, and she's sort of saying, well, these kids seem pretty lost, right? They don't understand their history. They don't even think about their own history. They don't have any sense at this point in time, when any political movement associated with the Haight-Ashbury had really eroded. They don't really have a sense of the politics of why people came there in the first place. And so all they can do is sort of, in her view, disintegrate, right? And that essay addresses that, and that pops up throughout her career.
I've got a question from James Long here. And as you mentioned earlier in your talk, you have been doing a lot of work on Norman Mailer and also Mailer's relationship with Joan Didion, and you're also a scholar of Philip Roth. Um, can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that these writers are in conversation with each other or aren't?
Yeah. Well, I think it's different, if we talk about Didion and Roth and Didion and Mailer. If there's one general thing that I think puts them in conversation, it's this um, interest in the turbulence of the moment in which they were writing as young authors, right? So writing in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and trying to contend with what, many people felt as dramatic and rapid changes. And so each one is kind of contributing to that in different ways. Roth is a little different in that his realm is really fiction. He's an excellent novelist. He has, non-fictional pieces, but not nearly as many as Mailer and Didion. And Mailer and Didion are really in this conversation amongst other new journalists, where they're trying to find new ways to write about the world around them, in a more honest, truthful way, right? By acknowledging how everything is filtered through their own lenses. And I think one of the other things that really links Didion and Mailer, and is something I'd like to explore more, is the way that both are dissatisfied with the categories of identity that are provided to them, right? So they're very different writers, they're very different people, but they're each iconoclastic in a way, right? Mailer had his left conservative politics that didn't allow people to really plant him in any particular political system. There are views that they express that can't really be claimed by any one group or another. They say things that seem to align them with one way of thinking, and then in the same breath say something that seems to reject that particular group or line of thinking. And so I think that that is courageous. It's something that I appreciate about both of their works. And I think is one way they're really part of the same conversation, that the way to really move forward is to question the movements, the groups, the categories of identity, the narratives associated with each of these, to really explore the nuances.
If you're just tuning in, we're doing a Q&A right now with Maggie McKinley, and this is an open forum, so if you've got a question, just put it in the chat. We've got a great one from Teresa Anderson that I'm excited to read here. So Teresa asks, for someone who has never read anything by Didion but is interested in examining the nostalgia element in her writing, which book do you suggest reading first? And I'll just start by saying, besides your book, which is pinned to the chat, there's a 40% off discount code. This is a shameless, but if you haven't read the book yet, this is a great chance to get it at a good discount.
I would say in terms of Didion's work, if you wanted to really get a sense of how she's grappling with nostalgia, um, I might suggest the White Album. I know that Slouching Towards Bethlehem as a collection of essays is the one that's often suggested for people new to Didion, right? Because it does really kind of capture her voice and include some of her most famous pieces. But the White Album, collecting essays that she'd written over the course of the 70s, right, in the decade since Slouching Towards Bethlehem, really is able to capture, I think, the dissatisfaction in so many different realms of society with the narratives that people have been sold about who they are, what America is. And so that might be a good place to start. And I would just say, if I had an option B, I would really recommend the essays that are collected in political fictions. And I think these don't get enough attention, but here's where she's really critiquing the way that um, the political system and what she calls the political class is using nostalgia to nefarious ends. And that way, if you read some of the essays from the White Album and some of the essays from political fictions, you can also kind of see the shift in the tone of her writing over decades, and also the way that her attention to nostalgia exists, but also evolves as she kind of develops and hones her interests and her skills.
We've got a great question here by Jim Bloom, which I think is a perfect transition, actually. It's a little bit long, so let's see. So Jim says, speaking of the now, Donald Trump first joined a political conversation with a paid ad calling for the execution of the Central Park Five. And since I think Didion first mentioned Trump and his brand new tower in her report of the jogger in Sentimental Journeys, and since nostalgia is a subset of sentimentality, I was wondering about your take on the relationship between style and rhetorical agenda or politics in that New York Review piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Sentimental Journeys, Didion's piece on the Central Park Five is fascinating. And I think that what I'll say first about the style and maybe structure of that piece is that, again, from having done a little archival research, I know that that was one piece that she struggled with the most at that time in her career. She really was attempting um, to write about a very difficult topic in a way that didn't sound like, again, she was victim blaming or that she was resorting to stereotypes or sort of aligning herself with any particular side. Um, I think that the way that the essay is so carefully structured in that way also connects to the content, right? So the rhetorical goal of the piece, which is to question the way that New York understands itself. And she's kind of watching in real time how the media is reshaping the narrative of the Central Park Five to kind of cover its tracks, right? So she starts off by sort of addressing this crime, right? And she's was, early on sort of could sense that there was something amiss in the trial and in the accused, and that this was not going to turn out well. But she's really concerned with the way that the media is suggesting that this is not something that could ever have happened in New York, right? Like New York used to be safe, and something like this, would not have happened in old New York. And this is the kind of sentimentality she's very critical of, right? This sort of revising of one's narrative of self-identity, because as she points out, like when did we think that New York or any city was ever safe? When did we ever think that we as a country or any city was free of racial bias or racism? It's one of the few times unfortunately, that she really engages with that kind of racial bias that's embedded in media and in the legal system. And so I think in the way she lays out her essay, sort of addressing each person involved, and talking to different people who have different stakes in the particular case she's trying to show, the way the narrative has been kind of rewarmed, recooked, to suit different agendas, which is what she's drawing attention to.
That's a great answer, Maggie. Thank you for that.
Mm.
I've got a kind of a general question for you. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the state of Joan Didion studies right now, and maybe what you'd like to see more of.
Mm. Um, so I think, well, one of the things that surprised me when I started to really dive into the scholarship is that there were not that many full-length academic scholarly texts on Joan Didion's work. There are a handful, and they're quite good. A lot of the pieces that have been published about her recently have been a little bit more biographical in nature. And I know there's another biography in the works now that more of her archives are open in the New York Public Library. So I would really love to see more engagement with her text as text, right? So I know that Didion is this alluring figure, and sometimes her reputation and her image can kind of overshadow some of the work, right? Also the case with Norman Mailer, interestingly enough, for different reasons. But I think I would love to see a little bit more of that, and I would really love to see more attention, as I mentioned, to some of the later works. I do think there's more to be said about her earlier pieces, right? And maybe push back on some of the previous interpretations of them. Some of the scholarship that exists on works like Run River is decades old now, right? So how can we reevaluate that now in light of our current moment? But I think, just being again careful not to turn Didion studies wholly into a study of who she was and what she kept from us, and what she did in her private life, but rather trying to understand what she means in her writing, right? This is the title of her last collection of essays, that were previously uncollected. Let me tell you what I mean. And then Hilton Els responded with this curated collection called What She Means, right? Sort of, I'd love to see more of that in writing, sort of taking the words that she provided us and using that, rather than, for example, the notes to John that were published in some of these more controversial personal documents that I don't think she necessarily owed us, but taking a look at her art instead.
I've got a couple questions on deck here, and we're going to try to get out of here by the top of the hour. So if you have anything else to ask Maggie, now is a good time to put it in the chat, and I'll make sure to look as I'm going through these questions. This might be outside of the purview of your work, but I thought I would ask anyway, because there's something nostalgic about what Didion kind of represents to people as well, like as a fan, and the ways that people kind of claim her. And so I was wondering if you wanted to speak at all about how nostalgia is working there.
Hmm. Yeah, I think this is so interesting, right? It adds another layer to the conversation. It almost seems like because there's all these fantastic images of Didion too. It's her work and it's also like the pictures of her standing next to the Corvette and with the cigarette, right? Something that's, this very romanticized images of her coupled with the specific way she's representing a moment, right? The Haight-Ashbury in 1967 or sitting in with the Doors in a recording session, right? All these like famous moments, her involvement in Hollywood, the parties she would throw with and invite Janis Joplin, right? And all of these things. I think it sort of captures like an aura of the time that is really attractive. And this seems really similar to me to, what Jameson was saying about the tendency of film and media to look back on a time and sort of create this capsule of it that's not exactly how things were, but makes us feel a certain way, right? So, in making a movie set in the 1950s, it might not be an accurate representation of the 1950s, but it's the 1950s in quotation marks, right? And I think it's in some ways it's kind of inevitable that Didion, with her stature and with the number of different people who read her and the attachments that we create between her work and things that have happened in our lives and maybe what we remember from specific times, I think it's inevitable that some form of that will happen, right? I think nostalgia is just it's an inevitable part of how we emote and how we remember certain things. But I think maybe staying true to the project of reflective nostalgia, just being aware as best we can of the fact that we're doing that, right? That we can enjoy that sort of snapshot that perhaps she is creating for us in our own memories, while also asking, well, why is that attractive to me? Like, what is it that I want to remember about my own past or American history that, that she's exemplifying there?
I love that answer, and thank you for indulging me. I've got one question and one comment here, and then I'm going to ask you kind of a final question so that we can close it out. But I wanted to read this by Teresa Anderson in the chat, who says, "Thank you so much. I too am a college level composition teacher, and I'm already thinking ahead to fall semester in syllabi development and wondering how I can incorporate nostalgia, especially the contrast between restorative and reflective nostalgia, into my course reading and writing assignments. I'll definitely consider incorporating Didion's work and your study on it into our course reading discussions and reflective writing."
Awesome. Love to hear
Thank,
it.
thanks, Teresa. I've got a question here from Aaron Good. Um, and Aaron asks, how would you contrast nostalgia in Didion's work with its role in the work of John Gregory Dunn, assuming that you've kind of worked with this person and know this person?
Hmm. Yes, well, I mean, Dunn, Didion's husband, also a writer. They were collaborators on many works. His that is a fascinating question, and I will just say thank you for that. And I feel like that's opened up another avenue of study for me because while I'm familiar with some of Dunn's work, True Confessions and his Las Vegas book, I hadn't really thought too much about the differences in the way that he might incorporate nostalgia into his text, but certainly it's there, right? Because he's writing about particular cultural moments, American history, identity. He's incorporating versions of his family, his daughter, his wife, as he knows and remembers them in sort of, semi-fictionalized takes. But their styles are so different as well. So I think that would be definitely worthy of further consideration.
I think this is my last question for you here, and it's just kind of similar. What's on deck? What are you working on right now? Do you have anything that's in the works?
hmm Well, in addition to that, great idea. Thank you for that the question that someone asked. And also wanting to maybe dive a little bit more into connections and contrasts between Mailer and Didion and some other new journalists. I'm still working on some of the authors that I mentioned at the top of the hour too. So I'm finishing up a piece on Philip Roth and empathy. It's going to come out in a collection on empathy in the works of Philip Roth, and I'm writing specifically on his novel The Plot Against America. And I'm also working on a piece on masculinity in the 1950s for an edited Cambridge collection. So these things are still on my mind, still working on them, and I'm hoping they'll inform future works on Didion as well.
Well, thanks again, Maggie, for being here with us today, and thank you also to everyone for tuning in and for your great participation. We really appreciate it, and yeah, we appreciate you spending your afternoon or evening with us wherever you're tuning in from. That's all we have for today. Before we go, Maggie, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, just I extend my thanks as well for attending and for the great questions. Thank you, everybody.
All right, that's all. Until next time.